As you can tell, I don't use computers really that often. So this is me. This is me at work. As Len said, it was actually between my junior and senior year. I did an internship at Hatch Show Print, was a book arts major at Montserrat, and graduated in 2014. That's me as a small child. And then the letterpress shop where it all started to get me to where I am today. And I like to show and kind of talk about, sometimes with interns that we have down at the shop that I learned everything I learned at, because they don't believe how small the Montserrat shop is, because they just think that every school is the same, and we're not. Montserrat wasn't a huge university. It doesn't have 10, 12 presses or anything. And if any of you work in there, you know that there's that one little cabinet of wood type, at least when I was there. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about today is my work, but also just working in a letterpress shop, in a shop really, post school, and what the past 6 years have been like. All the work you'll see, a lot of it's going to be work that's posters that I made at Hatch, but it's all things that I have made. And so while we're looking at this, you can compare the size of this shop to the next slide. This is where I work now. You could fit 8 to 10 Montserrat shops, I think, in this one room. So on the left side, that front table is where that's my work table right now, because we're doing a lot of COVID precautions. So everybody kind of has their own work table. So I have the front table. You can see it's a mess. That's kind of how I work. But you can see the large amount of space in the shops. When I first went down, and I'll add, when I interned, and I don't have photos of this shop because the computer that I had them on crashed. I interned at Hatch when the shop was still in its prior location, which was on Broadway in Nashville, which was a lot smaller than this. So when I went down in 2014, when I was hired, I went into this location, and that was my first look at this shop right now. So imagine going from this shop that's on the right photo, walking into this and seeing all of that. And even in those 6 years since I've started, I think there's a pointer tool I want to use. This press right here wasn't there. We had moved this press around. So things have still moved in the past 6 years. And there's been a lot of learning coming into this big shop. And as I go through these first few slides, I'll be talking pretty much just about the shop itself. So this is the second room. This is kind of the back of house. We call it the Mealy Room, and that's because this is the Mealy. So in this room is where we're going to be printing 100 posters, 200 posters, 300 posters, somewhere around there. And that's all hand fed. So this press over here is it's a little bit smaller version than the one that's at Montserrat, the 219 that's at Montserrat. This one can print a lot bigger, and I'll reference this. So you'll hear me reference, this is a Universal 1, 232, Universal 3. That's not really important right now, but as I get into some of the work later on in the talk, I might say the 232, and that's talking about this press, and you'll understand why it's just important to mentally note why I'm talking about that press. So in this room, there's the paper cutter, and so this is a huge hydraulic paper cutter, and where Hatch is located now, it's actually because our parent organization is the Country Music Foundation, which oversees the Country Music Hall of Fame and Studio B, where Elvis recorded and all that. So we're under this big umbrella, which will come up in a couple of slides, what that kind of means to I work within a shop that's underneath a larger organization. But because where we are now, we're in the same building as the Hall of Fame. And so right above the shop, there's a music theater where they have live shows. And so they also film like music videos or we'll have like private recordings or interviews or something. And if that's happening and we use the paper cutter, you can hear it loud and clear because this paper cutter is right under the stage. So right above this ceiling is like 10 feet from the stage. But you can feel this and hear it almost on the whole first floor. And then on the other side of the room, and this room itself is probably about 4 times the size of, maybe not 4, probably about 2 times the size of the shop at Montserrat, just to give you an idea of how big this paper cutter is. And then this press, which is one that I run a lot during the day. And so that's a big part of my job. It's an automatic press. It's a Mealy 29, but anything for a quantity of over 500, we run it on here. It's fully automated, meaning that you turn it on and you do all the settings, and then it has little suctions to pick up the paper and everything goes through, and it can print about 2,500 in an hour at its fastest speed. And in a couple of slides, I'll show you the guy who taught me how to run it. But also at the shop, this is my personal press that I own and the shop rents from me. It prints about 5,000 an hour at its fastest speed, but it's much smaller. But we use it to print a bunch of postcards and retail products, and I'll show some of the things that I've printed on there. But what's cool about it is, as opposed to this press and all the Vandercooks and everything are known as horizontal cylinder presses, so everything kind of lays flat on a table. This one, it's literally called a vertical, so it moves up and down like that when it's printing, and it's crazy to see it running. And every time we have, I mean, prior to COVID, if somebody visited the shop, we always like to show them this room because it's not something you see on one of the tours that we have 3 times a day. There's a tour that goes on and talks about the history of the shop to visitors and guests and stuff. But if we have like, we've had like musicians come to visit to pick up their posters, or because they happen to be playing in town that night and they come by and we show them this room, and every once in a while I'll be running this and it kind of blows their mind. But on the flip side, this press over here, it's called a Mealy Pony, but it's currently, all these photos of the shop were taken last week. So this is the current state. We're running out of space to put things. So sometimes we're not going to be printing for a while. We just use it to hold things. But the press was made in 1900. So it's 120 years old and we're still using it. We still print on it. It originally ran on steam. So it would hook up to what print shops used to have. The belt would go around this flywheel over here, or it would actually be down inside here, and they have a belt that would shoot up to the ceiling, connecting to what's called a common shaft, and then that would connect over to a steam engine. And so this press would literally run on steam, and it's the predecessor to this press by only 46 years or so. So a lot of what I do at the shop, in addition to printing, is I maintain all these presses, which means I need to have a knowledge of engineering in 1900 as well as 1946, and then up to about the 60s when the Vandercooks were ceased being made. So, and that was something, the maintenance wasn't why I was hired. I did the internship, and then when they had an open position, they really liked what I did in the internship and showed them like the work that I had made at school and everything. But within the past 6 years, and you don't really get to experience that at school because you don't use the presses nearly as hard as we are. You're not printing. Last year, I think we did 600 to 700 custom jobs, and that totaled 200 and I think 50,000 individual posters, and that didn't include postcards, greeting cards, all these other things. So we're talking of these presses are being used as hard as they were ever designed to be used constantly. And so outside of the presses, this is just a little more walk through the shop kind of thing. You probably noticed on the earlier photo of the shop, there's this huge wall of type. So all this, it's the length of the shop. It was built by, the shop was opened by two brothers, Charles and Herbert, and eventually Charles's son, Will T, took over. And between those three, these shelves were built to hold the type, so that it was, the height of each shelf is made for a specific height of type. It's not an IKEA shelving unit. And when they moved, they had to label every single part because it had to go back together exactly how it was up. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And some of these shelves, both the horizontal and the vertical pieces, are actually old cut up boards. And so it's something that they talk about on the tour is, at the end of the day, Hatch, even though it's 140, it'll be 142 in April. It was opened in 1879. It's still and always was a commercial shop. But nowadays we are kind of a working museum in a way, but it still is a commercial shop that pays its own bills with the work it does and employs. Right now, there's only, I think, 7 of us. But back in March, there was quite a few more. I think we were up to like 20-something employees, including tour staff. There was a layoff period in May where we had a lot of folks that no longer work there or are employed there. And then on the left, getting back to it, this big photo you can see of Roy Acuff. We refer to this as the Roy Acuff cabinet. And all these blocks are these old, what we'll call one sheet. So it literally takes a full parent sheet of paper, 26 by 40 inches, of advertisements that would be like the head, the blue, and the orange of Roy Acuff. Both blocks are in here somewhere, or on a back wall, which just is the same thing. It's just more of them. And so we have all these blocks that were carved sometime between 1900 to about 1952. And we still print all those blocks. We have a gallery where we sell all these restrikes. So that's another part of my job, where designing and printing custom work for clients, for the retail store, maintaining all the presses and the equipment, but also kind of working as an archivist and a conservator of these old blocks that need to be treated and printed, because the oil and the ink really helps treat them. It really helps keep them nice and moisturized and soft and supple, and makes them not crack, and they last for a long time. So the more and more that you're hearing over 6 years, there's more and more things that have been put on my plate. But it wasn't all immediately from the start like that. Like the point where when I started, it was just printer and designer. And I think a couple slides down, I'll get to it. But then there was a point where the person who was there, who was printing these one sheets, left the shop. So then that became something that everybody in the shop had an added responsibility. And then a couple of us, as we saw these presses breaking down, it was another added responsibility to make sure that, because some of these presses are older than these blocks, and we need to make sure that they keep being usable. Otherwise, we're going to lose money because we won't be able to produce what we produce. There's just some more shots of the shop. This left photo is all background blocks. So a lot of the posters you'll see that I talk about have kind of a full background. That's all these blocks. There's some of them are just solid pieces of wood in different sizes. Some of them, like one of them is a solid piece of like oak veneer. So it's got a different grain than I think there's a cherry wood veneer one. Some of them are perfectly solid. Some of them are linoleum. Some of them are really simple where it's just a circle's cut out. And then they get really complex where I don't think I have a photo of the poster, but there's one where it's carved tie-dye, or there's carved camo, or I think there's one where it's like etched linoleum, where Devin, who was the one who made it, he used Drano to kind of etch linoleum, and it looked like this weird, almost kind of like an aquatint on an etching plate, where it's not quite halftone, but it's kind of sandy looking. I don't have a photo of it because it wasn't a poster that I made, but there's all sorts of things in here. On the right, this is down in this section over here is our leftover ink. And you're probably kind of starting to notice there's a lot of organization in all this chaos. Like I can tell you exactly where, if somebody's looking for, I'm looking for the background block that has like a square cut out of it, I can tell you it's going to be in this section right here, because that's where all the background blocks that have little sections cut out of it are. We have like this top shelf is red, and then orange, and then yellow, green. So as crazy as all of these photos look, keep in mind that there is organization. Even going back to that wall of type, and I'll get to a photo soon where you'll see labels that are very crude, but they work. And so also in this right photo, this is some of these blocks are logo plates or photo plates that we catalog. It's the only thing that we physically have a database for, a digital database. So it's the only thing where if I were to zoom in on the photo, you would see like F and then a number, and that would just, in the database, it would say what it was for. And so this is getting back to those one sheets that I was talking about in that A-cuff cabinet. So this is actually a 2-sheet, but it's a good example of what's in that cabinet, A, and 2, that of what the carvings kind of look like, what the advertising, it's an advertising for a trailer company, American Trailers. And you'll probably notice that it's like stained red on both of them, but then around American, it kind of looks black. So the press that we have to print these on affords us, there's not inking rollers on it, so it affords us the opportunity to ink up one block in 2 different colors. So when we print the left side, we can just ink the whole thing in red, but when we print the right side, this part's in red, and then we can print the American black. And it lets us do things like that that are interesting. We could play around, and I'll get to it later. And I think it was one of the ones when Len posted in the Montserrat or the printmaking group, the Tyler Childers poster I did, where it's really colorful. So we can have a lot of fun playing with colors or doing gradients because we have full control of what gets inked when we're printing these kind of blocks. But these would be things where they would print like 50 of them and send them across the country to different American trailer dealerships, and they put them up in the window, because this patch has been open prior to radio and prior to, well, it opened the same year that I believe that the radio was invented, but in the rural South, or in the South in general, billboards and barn sides were where you advertise. So that's why we have so many of these big blocks. And so you could see it riding on your horse or in your carriage down the dirt road. Maybe not necessarily an American trailer, but some of the other ones, like the Roy Acuff, you'd put that up and you'd say Roy Acuff is playing here on this date, and you'd see it and you go, okay, let's pool together our monthly earnings and go have a night out on the town. And this is another example. This is a little bit of a smaller block, but the same idea is we print this on that same press. So it's a 2-color block, so we could print this all and say yellow, and then this right one all and say navy blue, and they'd line up perfectly. But sometimes what we do, and this is pulled off the website, is we'll ink this bottom section in orange, this top section in light blue, and then the second color all at once, and it gets us a little more color depth and variation. And we've even done where this top section is a gradation from red to orange, and then the bottom section is yellow. And so we can have a lot more control because we're inking it on that press that the American trailer was printed on. And so even though it's only 2 blocks, we could feasibly get 4 or 5 colors on there in the same amount of passes. So this is, again, and getting more back into the organization that we have in this massive chaos. On the left, these are chases. So if you're not familiar with letterpress or printing, these are just big metal frames that you have to lock the type in. So if you're using a platen press, there's a little smaller one. These are the chases for that big Mealy. But we have little pieces of tape that just tells us what's in it. Because at any week, we could feasibly have 3 different chases that need to be printed every day. So we know that this is the job that's in that chase. And sometimes we'll put first or second. Because what will happen, you're typesetting for a design and you go, oh man, I really need this specific A or this carving, and you don't know where it is. And then everybody's looking in the shop for it. And then we go in and we find out it's locked in one of these. So it really helps to have these taped and labeled. And that wasn't something, and a lot of this organizing wasn't something that was as prevalent when I started as it is now. But it came about because we kept adding more people working in the shop, which meant you needed to keep tabs on more things. One thing, though, I'm going to the right photo, that was there when I started, and this was there when I interned, is these little pieces of tape that say food or animals or things or it's the label, and that tells us this is just a section of the imagery blocks that we have. So if we're looking for a carving of a giraffe, I think we have one, we can go over to the animal section, and it might not be in the same exact spot every time, but we can almost guarantee that it'll be on that shelf when it's supposed to be, if it's put away correctly. But again, unlike those photo plates and those logos that I showed a little earlier, none of these are digitally archived, and we always have people on the tour ask us, how do we know where things are? And same thing with the type. And our answer is, you know where everything is in your kitchen. And so the first month I was there, I was looking for a lot of things and would take a lot longer to find something. And when you intern, your first week is almost just putting away type and learning the shop, because you need to know where things are in the shop. And the same thing would be like if none of you had gone into the Montserrat shop yet, and then tomorrow somebody told you to go in and make something, it would take you a lot longer than had you already been working in there for a month and you know where everything is. You just it's that muscle memory. So we can go over, and there's still days where there's 5 of us looking for a specific guitar carving, but we can't find it. So then there's 5 of us, and then it takes the third person looking in the same spot to find it, even though it should be labeled. Just more organizing. Whoops. The photo on the left is older photo plates, and you kind of got a sneak peek, but those would be where some of the photo plates from 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s are in there. Those aren't necessarily archived digitally because they predated computers, in essence, so there wasn't really a system. I guess there was books at one point, but we just know in this cabinet is where we find the Hank Williams or the Johnny Cash photo plates. And then this shelf is, you can kind of see the ink over here. So we go through a lot of ink, and I don't think I took a photo of the whole ink, but each one of those cans, I think, is 5 to 7 pounds. And so you can compare that to, I don't know what still gets ordered at Montserrat, but I think we were using like 1 pound cans when I was there. So we go through a lot, but the main focus of this photo is the shelves that I use a lot. You can see that there's a lot of oil. We go through a lot of oil. There's random press parts, and it looks insane, but I know exactly what's on each shelf, and goes back to the organizing. So if somebody is fixing something in the shop and they go, oh, I need this or that, I can tell them exactly where it is. And it keeps that workflow and that production time, because the organization helps keep production up, but it also decreases downtime. And in a shop where it's a commercial shop, and the purpose is to make sure that you're not spending more time, more money on labor and materials than you are on what you're going to make from the poster, is pretty important. And as like cliche as it is kind of time equals money. That's why we have an automatic press, because for us to print 500 posters on that automatic press that I showed her a little earlier, it takes about the same amount of time as somebody to print about 100 posters hand cranking them. So there's a big, if you had to hand crank 500 posters, you'd only be able to get so much done in a day, where if you were printing them automatically and it was flying, you know, you'd have another 6 hours of work left to work on other jobs. And I didn't take any photos of them because they are client sensitive, but we all are balancing like 3 to 4 jobs at a time, and they all are just in manila folders. And so again, it's just keeping organized and keeping your space. But you saw that front table where I work, and it looks insane, but one pile is like retail things that I need to reprint, and one pile is custom jobs that I'm working on. And so it's a little controlled chaos, which I probably have said about 4 times, but it really is, the day-to-day is controlled chaos. So here's just some photo. These are some of the photo plates that are in that cabinet that I just showed you. So on the left, this is the original Hank Williams photo plate. You can see it's copper. So we still use it though when we reprint. We have one, I think we have one poster in the retail store that we use it on because it's a restrike of one of his shows that we made a poster for originally, and then we have the rights to reprint it. Same thing with the Johnny Cash. This thing's been, I think I printed it personally like hundreds of thousands of posters, and we use it on a couple different ones, but it's the original one from the first time that it was ever made. And then in addition to musicians, the one on the left is Dwight Eisenhower. So we've done political posters. We have a bunch of different governors and senators, especially here in Tennessee. It's not nowadays, but when it used to be like 50s, 60s, 40s, we have a lot of photo plates of the governors and people running for office, local and statewide. Not a lot of president photo plates, so this is kind of a rarity. And just to compare it, that this Hank Williams one is probably about 3 by 4.5 inches, or the Eisenhower one is about 13 by 20 inches. So they range in sizes. The photo plate, I'm just showing a print of the Elvis one, but it is the original, it's a print from the original block, but it's because the block is locked into one of those Mealy chases. But you can see they still print great. So even though they're decades old, they're still printing just as good as originally. So now I'm going to get into another thing that I kind of like to tell when we have interns. I like to tell them is they always ask, like, how do you know where this is or that is, or what they kind of well, sometimes they'll ask, how do you know that this will work or that will work on press, like this technique? And a lot of it's through experience and learning. And what I like to tell them is I learned more, I think, in the first year at Hatch than I did in 4 years at Montserrat. And that's not because Montserrat didn't teach me anything. It's kind of two parts. One, it's a different world. It's a production shop. We're making art, we're designing, but we need to make sure that we also kind of make the money and get the jobs out the door because we're working on deadlines. And two, it's because of the people that I get to work with every day who have been there much longer than I have. And so this guy over here, this is I mean, you can see it's from 98. That's Dan Brown. So now today he's 80, not like today, but I think he's 88 now. And he's the one who showed me how to run the Mealy. He still comes in, not at the moment because of COVID, but he would still come in 2, 3, 4 days a week right up until we got kicked into quarantine. Still has so much to share with everybody in the shop. And that's also, and then another generation of people is this guy, Harry Beatty, is the one who taught Dan. So you can see, like, I'm learning things that Dan was taught probably in the 90s that Harry learned maybe in the 80s or 70s. So, and those are two men that were, Hatch, even though today you kind of think of it as a design place, there's a lot of great creativity. There was a point, and both of these men were very much mechanically inclined, could fix things, could make things work, but they were printers. They weren't necessarily designers. They weren't necessarily artists. And so I learned a lot about just printing and about making things work. And if something broke down middle run, learning ways to kind of make the press get through the end of the run so that you could then spend some time to fix it properly. But there's times where Dan would say, well, Harry always told me to do this or that. And so I still learned a lot from him. And then this is a much younger than today, Jim Sheraton. He was the manager of Hatch for almost 30 years. Came in the 80s, but he's much more of the artistic side, but also where a lot of us in the shop learned the conservator aspect. So like I mentioned, printing those old blocks and understanding how to make sure that we don't damage them further, making sure the prints look good, but also choosing why are we printing this one in that color. And he came from that background. So when he left, that's when we took over printing those one sheets that I had shown a little earlier. And even now, I still call Dan every couple weeks just to check in on him until he's back in the shop and make sure that he is still growing his tomatoes and all the other weird stuff he does. And I still talk to Jim all the time and went up to talk to him at his house a couple weeks ago. And then this is a photo of everybody. I think sans one person who is a designer at the last Christmas party. Fun fact, the mustache I have now is not the same mustache as I have in that photo. I had regrown it since then. But from the people that you see, the only people, so Kathy, Devin, Sarah, and Amber aren't in the shop anymore. They were really unfortunately laid off, and we're all really feeling it. But in modern times, and working around all these great illustrators and designers and printers and color theorists and, you know, X, Y, and Z, I get to work with these people 40 hours a week, and we bounce ideas off each other all the time. And that's a really big thing that I would say, even, I mean, for the rest of your life, is find people that you can have those conversations with, and really try to find people that you can have that will say, I don't think that's working. Because if you just surround yourself with people who want to just give you approval all the time, it doesn't necessarily help you grow. And so working around these people all the time, they, you know, we'd see each other try something and get really interested, because it would be something that, like I mentioned, like Devin did the etching of the linoleum block, and that's something none of us had done before. And so we were really interested in learning all about it once he got it to work. And I mean, I could go through for another 20 minutes about like the incredible, like, specific strengths that each one of them have, that if I ever had a problem, I would go to a different one of them to talk through with them, and same thing as they would come to me for certain things. But that's one of the biggest things, I think, in 6 years that I won't say I took it for granted, but it was definitely something that I am missing now, that all of them are not still in the shop, because there's just less of us to bounce ideas off, and less of us to talk things through and try to figure out a plan B and all of that. And I mentioned doing the maintenance on all the presses. These are just some of the reasons, some of the parts books and manuals, and I have to know the presses inside and out, and all of us in the shop do. And you'll see it's so that we understand the limits of the presses and what they were designed to do, and we're trying to constantly push them to those limits so that we can push the limits of design, I guess is the best way that I can describe it. And you'll see it in a couple of slides of what I mean. But I mean, these are the printer's Bibles that I have, and I reference them all the time. And this little pocketbook here is literally, it fits in a shirt pocket, but it has little things like, is your press doing this? Try fixing this. And sometimes that's all it takes. And so having these on hand is like having a second or third Dan Brown or Jim or anybody in the shop. Some of those books have helped me print these tiny photo plates. So you saw the giant Elvis, which is about 13 by 22, I think, tall. And this is one where he's not even 2 inches wide, but still prints great. Same thing with the dolly. This is from a photo about the size of that Hank Williams one. Now she's the size of a quarter. I think it was a 1x1 square that she is. And these were printed for postcards for I had to print like 17 or 19,000 of 3 different postcards that were all going into the Ken Burns country music documentary that were being sold at Walmart specifically. So this is one thing, getting back to like knowing the inside and out of presses. For those who might not be familiar, this is what would be called a worm gear. This is what makes an oscillator roller go side to side, which would smooth out your ink on your press, make it nice and even. So if you were doing a split fountain or a rainbow roll or a gradient or whatever, it would have that nice blend in the middle. But it's so that letterpress printing presses keep a nice even thin layer of ink. And so we were discussing about how to make tighter split fountains. And so what I did is had some silicone mix, and we made a cast of the original one, and then with some really quick setting resin, casted a duplicate. But I filled in these outer channels with some clay before casting it in the silicone, so now it just has a tighter path. So it actually shortened it by, I think, about an inch, so there's an inch less travel. And we've tried it once and it worked pretty good. We're debating on if we want to make it even tighter, and there's not really a specific reason. These are just, again, things that when you're working with 6-7 other people, sometimes you just go, I wonder if I could do that. And then we sit there and we try to figure out like how to do it, because the way we work, and soon I'll be getting into some of the posters that I made and talking about working with clients and things, but we don't necessarily have the opportunity to try things before sending an idea to a client. So we have to sort of figure out how we're going to make it work before sending it to a client. And so we're always trying to think of these crazy things to up our design game while still keeping it production friendly.
So Cory, that's a good example of like using a technical like engineering thing to figure out something aesthetic.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's exactly what it is. It's all engineering. And you know, you have to understand the angles. I mean, not really, because it's a you know, it's a mold, but there were parts where I had to kind of, you need to know that these aren't just perfectly, and like the piece that goes into this, it's a little wishbone, but that wishbone has a specific shape, and it needs to be able to turn so it can go back and forth and not get caught. And so it is understanding inside and out, so you can make these adjustments without damaging something else on the press. And that's a big part of it, is you need to know, what can I do to change this that won't affect something else negatively? And it also helps if something breaks on the press or you hear a weird noise. A lot of times people will go, Cory, something's making a really weird noise. I go over and I have them do it, and I can almost all the time narrow it down to at least where it's coming from, if not knowing exactly what it is. Part of that's having those books that I showed you of all these parts and everything. Part of it's, I've probably heard the noise 100 times before. I've probably seen the same exact problem. I know that the Universal One does this all the time. So it's kind of an experience thing, and being there for 6 years and living through it, but it's also knowing what parts are supposed to move, what parts aren't supposed to move, and what they're doing. And then this is not something about the changing the press itself, but this was a recent job that I did where I needed to understand the limitations of the press. And so on the left, you can see this was the final print. So there was a background block where I did a little pressure print to kind of make it look like the leg of the R went behind it. But when you pressure print type, you always get these weird edges. But I wanted to do a sort of chromatic type and have a lighter section and a darker section. And so one thing we use a lot in the shop is called Cintra Board. And it's this white stuff. It's foamed PVC. And you can draw on it with like a ballpoint pen and it'll make a mark, or you can cut it into very specific shapes like letters and just double stick tape it to stuff. But for this example, I needed to double stick tape it to the top of the type. And then, so if you're not aware, the type in letterpress is all 0.918 inches. It's just referred to as type high. It's a set standard in America and like the UK. It's different in other places, but for what we're doing, it's always 918. And this Cintra board is about, I think it was a 1/4 inch tall, which means it was going to be way over type high taped on top of this type. but that was helping me with registration and making sure. I mean, this, you can see that some parts overhanging, but that was from me not cutting the Cintra board exactly. But what I needed to understand was this press I'm printing on has an adjustable press bed, meaning you can raise it and lower it to a certain extent. And so I knew I could lower the press bed down far enough to where now this Cintra board was actually type high from, or was not type high, but it was not going to be too tall, which would result in damaging the type. And because we work in a shop where some of this type, and this type specifically, might be from the 40s, and we can't damage it because we don't replace it, I needed to know that this press was able to do this job by lowering it far enough that the impression taken off of this height, where you can see it's inked up green, was going to be the correct height.
So Cory, it sounds like you're using a lot of what you know to constantly, well, maybe not constantly, but like reinvent the wheels so that you can get to where you need to be.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much spot on. I think it's reinventing the design and using ready-made materials often, and you'll see it a lot in the posters, because I'm almost at where I'll be starting to show a lot of the posters. We don't want to always be wasting time, and not really wasting. We don't always want to be spending our time carving something new. Like, I could have easily just carved this for the top of the R and the bottom of this D that you see on the right out of a piece of wood, but then we would have just had that piece of wood. And the Cintra board is a lot more one use, it's done. Like I said, you can double stick tape it to something, the registration will be spot on. It also prints really nicely, which is one of the things, and it does take a little compression, where if I was using wood and I damaged it, that was it. But yeah, it's definitely reinventing the wheel in terms of design and art, and understanding the presses enough to make sure that whatever wheel we put on there isn't going to be something that will damage the presses or take so long that it's actually not worth it. Like, I don't want to be taking 8 hours to be making this one poster. I want to be able to make sure that I can print this in a day, the whole poster, instead of just one color. So now I'll be starting to get into some of my work. This is 2 carvings that I did, I think, in 2015. So this is kind of where my work looked about 5 years ago. This print over here is about 22. They're both 22 by 30, roughly. So they're large. You can see a lot of playing with different textures of carving and using colors and inking in different ways to kind of get that sky to almost look like there's some clouds in there, maybe. But early on, just trying different things to understand how to get what I wanted it to look like for future projects. And then same on the right, playing around with different typography and just having fun with designing my own little bottle shapes and typefaces and things like that. And at the same time, I think this might have been about 2016, I was doing a lot of this like symmetry work, and using different colors, and I guess thinking of it almost like 2D design, where it was, I had all these ready-made shapes because they're all pieces of type or little things that we would call dingbats or shapes, but they're things that were ready-made, so that I wasn't carving anything. And like in this one, I would print, you can see this black behind the white. I only would typeset one corner of it and then print it from 4 different directions to get the corner. So playing with symmetry in that way. With the white, I think I only set like one of these and then printed it, moved the paper, printed it, moved the paper, printed it. And that was I think a way to of how I was understanding the presses, but I was still kind of early on in working at Hatch and still really nailing down the techniques. But it helped me learn how to do things quickly on press, and it helped me understand how to achieve a desired effect. Like this kind of, it's not each line of eyes is a different color. I didn't set all those lines at once and then print them in a gradient sort of thing, but I printed one, moved it, printed it, and then just changed the ink color. So it was kind of like seeing what colors worked with each other, but also looking at repetition and pattern. Because I mean, if I'm printing the same poster 200 times, the repetition doesn't come in the poster itself, but in doing it. And so I think there was something to that effect that it was intriguing me about doing repetition. And these now it'll be a lot of like Hatch things for a while, and then get back to the work that I'm making today. And I didn't put any of these in necessarily an order of when I made it at Hatch, because that's not as important as just seeing all the things that have been made. And a lot of them, I think, don't predate 2016. And it's not because I'm not like proud of what I made in 2015, but like I said just with that last slide, I was still understanding what was going on, the design, and what I was doing. So these are just some of the things that I've made for the retail store. Like this postcard is one that was printed on that vertical that I mentioned. I think all of these actually were, except for this measurement one. And so you can see it's a wide range of. The Nashville Postcard is actually one of our one sheet blocks shrunk down, but then I colorized it to be printed in a yellow, red, blue 3-color, so not CMYK, but CMY. And I learned a lot, and I put this close up on purpose, is learning a lot about the angles, because it's not dots, it was with lines, because that would be how they used to do it in old engravings. So we were trying to stay true to the era that original block would have been carved, even though the block itself doesn't have those lines. Learning how they would use 3 colors to make 8, just like you would in a CMYK screen print or anything. And then I do a lot, and you'll see a lot of this. I build a lot of things out of type. So there's this little cowgirl and a little cowboy, and then this is like a baby card that we also make in a boy, where the front is this baby that has a pacifier or lips. Sometimes people think it is. But then you flip it over and then it's a crying baby. But again, using these ready-made blocks that already exist to make all of this. So none of these are plates. Everything was an individual piece, even his little shirt pockets and the little curves on his hat. Some other things for the retail store, and I'll talk about it in a few slides too. The NFL draft was held here last year in Nashville. It was a really big thing. We did a lot of work with the draft, and you'll see it in a little bit. But we also were making other football related things, because there was going to be like 1 million people in Nashville. And so we knew we could make something. And even if we only sold 100 of them, it was some sort of money. So I made this little tabletop football game for kids where it's perforated and this cuts out down here, and then you can fold these up and you have 2 little footballs to play. And then I don't know if you're familiar or not with the game Cornhole. I designed a cornhole board using imagery that's already in the shop. So none of it was new imagery that I drew. It was all, I think there's 3 different one-sheet blocks that were originally carved in the 30s for midway shows, which is, you wouldn't have a fair in Nashville and Knoxville. You'd have one halfway, so you could get both cities. And so it would literally be called the midway. And so we made a cornhole board because cornhole is a really big thing down here, which I was kind of familiar with before I moved down here, but it's a real big thing for tailgating. This is a Halloween poster that I designed a couple years ago. I mean, pretty straightforward. It's a 2-color set of blocks. So the yellow and the orange are blocks that were carved in the shop probably sometime in the 30s or 40s. We're not entirely sure what it was originally carved for, but we still have them. And so we like I said, we like to use what's in the shop. We like to reinvent the wheel, kind of like Len said, but reinvent what the blocks were used for. So maybe it was to advertise that there was a trick or treat at like the American Legion or something. And then just putting some dancing type, this is Happy Halloween, breaking that straight flat bottom, something just a little more fun than a straightforward poster. And it's a very big seller, as simple as this poster is. This is one of the first projects that was a very long project for me to work on. It's a whole set of cards, ace to king, front and back, the Joker, the box, even the little square that keeps the box closed, and that's a sticker until you open it. This project also, because we worked with, I think Bicycle, or the company that prints the Bicycle playing cards, printed them. I had to make Illustrator files, and I had no idea how to use Illustrator at all until this project. And I think this was in 2017 is when I made these. So, at that point it was 3.5, almost 4 years that I had been at Hatch, and I didn't use Illustrator because I never needed to, because everything we did we could do on Photoshop, but these had to be vectored. The company literally couldn't make plates with raster files. And it was a long time, and there's definitely things like if I would do it now, I know so much better about Illustrator, how to do the things a lot quicker. Plus the program has gotten better, but it was kind of a point, and we get a lot of interns that are very great on the computer, but not necessarily with their hands, and then vice versa. And I think it's a good thing to explain to students or even professors, because we do get interns that are older, they're not in school, they might be professors, they might just be independent artists that are interested. Is the shop isn't full of people who are really savvy on the computers. There's still people in the shop that are much better than me. But being good on the computer doesn't translate to being good on the press, and vice versa. And so, again, that kind of links back to having 6 or 7 other people. I had 2 people that were walking me through doing some of this work on the computer, and then I walk them through something on press. And so it's a big family, but also it's a studio, because at the end of the day, my name isn't on these cards. So it's the shop. And so the shop is what's important, is that this logo has to look good and the work has to look good, because this is what is selling this product. So it wasn't me selling this playing card. And then this is one of the first book designs that I did. So I think it was in 2015, and this specific book and the design won an EPCA award for design for that year. There's a lot of, Nashville itself has a lot of printing history, but it's also a very big publishing industry still. And so this was published by Lifeway, I think. And so the publisher came to us. It was this guy who really, really always wanted to work with us, and he was great. I had an initial face-to-face meeting because their office was right down the street. And he just wanted that classic, what people will say, the classic hatch look, which typically means these rays in some way, maybe a star. I didn't put any stars on this, but stars, these rules, and then using this Gothic type, the sans serif, straightforward type. So I put this together, and this is something that I think we have a lot of folks come through the shop, interns, and even people who work there, myself included, is, again, it's not our name attached to it, it's the shop. So even if you're not in agreement with what the book is, and in this specific instance, Russell Moore is the president of the Southern Baptist convention, but ethics convention, I think. So, and I'm not a religious person at all. So I had no idea what that was, but I asked one of my friends who is, and he was like, oh yeah, he's like very, and I learned this I think about a year ago. He's one of the few who's actually been like very against the current administration, which is kind of like, he's kind of an outcast. And that doesn't mean anything, but I had no idea because it didn't matter. But we've had jobs for, gun companies, and guns are a hot topic issue. And we have jobs for big banks, and that's you might have strong feelings about that. But at the shop, and we have to remind folks a lot of the time, is we won't ever print anything in a negative connotation. So it didn't matter that I wasn't a religious person. It just mattered that I made this kick-ass design. And then so they loved this front design so much that what they wanted to do is design the inside of the book jacket so that when you folded it out, you would have one of the 5 of these little posters. And I think they are, if I remember correctly, they're quotes from the book. So if you bought the book, or if you bought 5 of them, you could have one of each one. And so this is what the cover jacket looks like. So, and then the inner ones, and you can see we reversed it so the type was in that cream color and the color was the background. But I only designed this section, and then what they did is they put together, based off of this, the rest of the cover. So even like this type and the spine and everything. And then they came back to me, and then we had a back and forth again about finalizing the design. And this is a little bit tweaked from the initial one, but I think this was a really good project for me early on because it was a very in-depth one. Learning the ropes too about interacting with something that we weren't going to print. And so that was, the poster, this was a poster that I think they sold to like the first 300 people who pre-bought the book, but I wasn't going to print the book cover. So, but I still needed to know kind of how book design worked. And I didn't really know. I sort of did, and you're probably going, well, weren't you a book arts major? But I didn't understand the I don't know like all these little things that need to be on books. And so seeing those and learning those, it was an interesting process for this job. Another big job, and this was in 2017 or 2016, the Nashville Predators played literally across the street from where I work, and Nissan has a huge headquarters in central Middle Tennessee, and they're a big sponsor for the Predators. And so these are only 3 of them, but I think I did 9 designs, one for each car that Nissan sold, and they were big designs. They were 22 by 30, and then eventually they were blown up into these banners that were hanging inside the arena where the Predators played. And then they used them in these in the game, like little game books, I guess you would call them. And this was another good project because I was working with one. I had to make sure all 9 looked similar. 2, I was creating files for another design or another printing process that wasn't letterpress. So I was learning all about pre-press work and what files needed to have certain specifications. But I was also working one with a big client, and then they had hired a creative team to work with me. So I was interacting with, I think, like 5 or 6 different people on a lot of conference calls, and it was something that at the time I wasn't really comfortable with discussing phone call, like on the phone with clients. And so it helped me kind of get my ground and be better about what I need to get from the client on the initial contact to make sure that I have a good starting point. And around this time, I was starting to really understand how to interpret a client's wording, because they're not always going to be able to put into words exactly what they want, because they might not know the lingo and they might not know how to phrase what they're looking for. So, and this also goes back to that first year, and even that first 2 years, there was so much that I learned that's kind of also why a lot of what I'm showing you won't be from 2014 or 2015, because almost every month I was learning so much stuff that was new that it was like starting over on where I was design-wise, technique-wise, and all of that. But one cool thing, and I wish I could have taken photos of it, is now, because those banners were only up for a year, the shop has all 9 of the banners that were in Bridgestone Arena, which is where the Predators play. We have them in the shop, just rolled up. And one day we want to hang them somewhere, but we can't figure out where yet. This was a big and favorite job that I think I've done. This was the last issue of Playboy that I think was printed physically. I believe it's all digital now. But they came to us. They were doing this article about visiting Nashville, and they wanted us to do a design. And this was 2017, 2018. So this, I had that experience working with the Nissan folks, and this was only one guy. I was working with the senior creative director. He kind of let me do what I had to do. He had a few tweaks here and there, but this was pretty much the first design that I had sent. But that goes back to when I had that first phone call with him. I was able to read between the lines and was able to get this done quick. And it was also a job that had to be done within, I think, from the time I started until the time I needed to get the file ready for it to print in the magazine was 2 weeks, which is very, very fast for us. And it's not something we would typically do, but this was a big deal for the shop to have the reach that this magazine had to get our design in there. It was something that the shop hadn't done before to get in this magazine. And I had a lot of fun with it. And this is a block that was originally used in some advertising back in the 30s. So it was a neat nod to something that the shop has had in the blocks, and using this old cut of you can see a little bit over here of like a jazz ensemble or a big band ensemble. And so using all these older imagery on this very modern magazine, but it all worked together really well. It's probably one of my top 10 projects to work on just because of how fun it was. And working under a crunch was pretty fun. That's something that I've kind of come to love, is not everybody can work under deadlines. And sometimes they do get to you and they stress you out, but there's something fun about knowing you got 2 weeks to get this job done. And 2 weeks sounds like a long time, but when you're balancing 6 or 7 other jobs at the same time, and sometimes your client won't respond in a day, it kind of shrinks those 2 weeks down to you got about 2 days to make this work. So these are just getting into some of the posters that I've done. These are John Mulaney, Jim Jeffries. You know, we do comedians, shows. I don't think I put any posters of like generic conferences or anything, but just having some fun with different designs, making the border. A lot of times we don't have deep meanings into why we do things. I think like the merch for his tour, for Kid Gorgeous, the tour was like a photo of him with a halo. So I put a halo and pressure printed out the top of the J.
Oh, that concert. It was amazing. So
the Mulaney one?
Yeah, the Kid Gorgeous. It was so amazing. I didn't see that one, but I came to DC, and that's where I'm originally from, and it was so good. Oh my God. Awesome.
Yeah, and so you'll see a lot of DPAC is a venue we just work with a lot. So a lot of these posters, you'll see that on. Same thing with the Ryman Auditorium. You'll see a lot of those. The Ryman is where the Grand Ole Opry originated. It's still, the building's still the same. It's right down the street from us. We do every show that they have here, every non-Opry show. We don't do any of the Opry shows posters anymore, but you'll see a lot of those names. And these are two venues where they let us have a lot of fun with the posters. The only difference is at DPAC is the one who approves the design, where with the Ryman, we send Ryman the proof, and then they'll send it to, in this case, Jim Jeffries' camp. And so it might just be the manager, it might be the promoter. Sometimes it is the musician or comedian or speaker or whoever who does approve the design. But there's always a lot more back and forth with the Ryman shows. And this is a good example of, this photo plate is one of those ones that would have been in that cabinet from earlier on in the talk, where it's a photo plate of, we're not sure the name, but this pin that's getting covered up is not an Oddfellows, a Mason, a Freemason pin. So he might have just been a Freemason who was also, maybe he was running for mayor or governor or state senate or whatever. And like on this, Jim Jeffries is from Australia, and the tour might have been called like Burning Hot or something like that. So it's literally, we are like skimming from the top and how deep our meanings are of like, let's put I'm going to put some flames on it because it's hot. We work with a lot of sports teams. So the Predators in 2018, they wanted to do a poster for every round that they went in the playoffs. This was for the first round. They usually get a limited edition. They didn't, I think they only got to the second round that year, which is irrelevant, but the Mighty Ducks in 2018, so that the Predators one, the poster was made in the spring of 2018. The Ducks management saw this specific poster and loved it and wanted to get one because in the fall, in the opening of their home games in the fall season, 2018 was the 25th year of the Anaheim Ducks. And so they brought back like the Mighty Ducks uniform. They just wanted to celebrate it with a fun poster. So we work with, it doesn't matter who you are. I mean, we do jobs all over the US, Canada. We've done stuff in England. I've shipped stuff to Germany. We'll take anybody's job. The Tennessee Titans in 2018, this was a gift for their season ticket holders. And you can see in the bottom right, it says limited edition to 22,000. That's not a joke, as we literally had to print 22,000 of these. And that was printed on the Mealy. It took 4 8 to 9 hour days of printing just to print it. It was 2 pallets of 12 boxes each, 12 paper boxes each of posters. and they went out on a trailer. The largest job that Hatch has ever had was $56,000. They did a whole tour for the Red Hot Chili Peppers that was sponsored by Heineken. But they didn't print them all at the same time, where this was 22,000 printed within a week. And it was a long week, but it was fun. And it was fun to work with. I worked directly with the Titans designer on this poster, and he was a great guy, and we got along really well. And they wanted to celebrate this institution that's been around for a long time, and also celebrate the 20 seasons of being in Tennessee. And we're always happy to, and we love helping local businesses, sports teams, whatever, celebrate milestones. And I mentioned the draft came in 2019. When we did the draft, I didn't put any of the posters in here, but we worked directly with the NFL, the New York office and the LA office, and the shop did a design for every team. And then we also designed, I think, 9 other ones, where 7 of them were the top 7 picks. I think they were they were the 7 players that were hot players for the draft. And these are just 3 of the players that I did. I didn't do any of the other ones. I only did 2 of the teams. But these posters ended up being murals as well. So when the draft was here, they put these up on, or I think maybe 2 of them, up on the side of buildings as murals. So these posters then became huge. But working with the NFL was really fun. And around this time in 2019, I'm starting to really understand, working with clients, what they're looking for. This was also, we had already done all the team posters for the NFL when we started doing these, so we already knew what they wanted. But having fun playing with it, and again, skimming off the top, his nickname was the Electric, so I put some lightning bolts on it, and just had some fun with drop shadow and some light colors. And I mean, it's not too deep meaning of any of these, just to make them larger than life, I think was one of the lines they used, is to make them it's about the player. It's not about the draft on these posters. Here's a 2015 one, 2 2015 ones. So going back to then, this is kind of just they were on their 50th anniversary tour. So I matched a poster from that first tour, where they had an old Mustang or something on the poster. And doing that, kind of understanding what made that design so powerful, and learning the layout of these little live in concert, one night only things, and seeing how dates are set and differently, and seeing design from different eras. The design for this Nick Offerman and Megan Mullally was actually a rejected design from another job, but I loved it so much that I didn't put it away and just reused it for this design, and they loved it. I think I sent the proof out for them to approve. And all the proofs, before I get too far into it, all the proofs for all these designs are always black and white. So the client doesn't see red and black. They would see the red would be a gray, and then black. And then I would say, oh, it'd be red and black. But it was within a couple hours, I think I got an approval on this one. And I know that, I think, at least back then, Nick and Megan were doing a lot of the approvals themselves, and still do. They're very much work, because they're single people. They do a lot of their own things and make their own calls. And so this is actually, I think, the 3rd job I did at Hatch. But you can see there's a lot of playing around with different techniques from here through the rest of the talk. And these blocks right here, it's printing furniture. So all the stuff that would be between the type and it's not type high, it's bumping that up, but so I can print all this texture that's on it and make it kind of look like the side of a barn wall or something like that. Warren Haynes is, I want to say he's the lead guitarist or something from some jam band. So kind of like earthy, crunchy. I don't even remember. I don't think he had any merch, so it was like kind of hard. It was just like, let's make a poster with his name on it that he might be into. And this was one where it was for all these folks were guitarists and they were raising money for the Buchanan Area Ministerial Association. So I just designed it so all this type fit into the shape of a Les Paul. I believe like the main guy only played Les Pauls, and they might have all only played Les Pauls, but then when you put two posters together, this side of the guitar met up with that side of the guitar, so it kind of repeated. The Delamay, this is jean that I glued, like denim that I glued to a piece of wood. So if you were to zoom in, you could see all the cross stitching and everything. And then experimenting with gradients and how overlapping works. It's really bright in this photo, but on the poster, and it's because it's printed on coated paper, you can't really tell where this black rectangle ends and where the black of the solid starts. So it kind of fades like out to just solid black as you go to the bottom. So these are just, I mean, wrestling, but then also like 90s bands. This header block is an old block because the shop used to do a lot of wrestling posters. This part's cut out because it had the name of the promoter, and the block had been cut out, but it was fun to just design a straightforward wrestling poster. It wasn't like luchador wrestling. We just happened to have two luchador masks. The Hootie and the Blowfish one was actually kind of a joke how that one came together, where I had all this type set and had it kind of how I wanted, and I was looking for something to put behind everything. And we have this block that you see on this poster in the shop, and nobody knows what it was carved for. We think maybe it was for like a silent auction, but I mean, it doesn't look like a finger. And so it was kind of a joke that I was going to print it, and then the job got approved. And it was just so like it was just a fun job to work on because it was so like, I didn't think it was going to get approved. I had 3 other blocks that I was ready to like exchange it with. But they loved it. And it was part of, they were playing like 3 shows at Colonial Life Arena because Hootie and the Blowfish is from South Carolina. And so this was like one of 3 that we did, and 2 other people did one. And so it was just a really fun post. Both of these were really fun posters to work on. Not even for what they're for, just to make them. This is playing with some color. So doing some split fountains. One thing, this is where I mentioned the 232 to keep in mind. If you see a split fountain where the bottom is one color and the top is another, that means it was printed on the 232 or that Mealy, where if it's the left is one and the right is another, that was printed on one of the other presses. And it's just, the 232 is so much bigger, you can feed the paper where this side is what would be in the grippers and go through like, I guess that way instead of this way. So just having some fun with a band that I really like and got to go to the show. They had just put out a new album that had a bunch of flamingos on the front, so I put them in a monk's robe, and they were into it. Doing a poster for Santana, the color behind everything is, I took some ink and thinned it out with mineral spirits, and used a rag to kind of wipe it around on some of that coated paper that we have. And so it was a run of 100 posters, but only 2 posters ever looked similar. So throughout the whole run, they would have changed dramatically. So that was one where I kind of had to explain that to the venue. This venue, Spokane Veterans Memorial Arena, they actually use the posters to promote the shows where they're not selling them as merch. And so I had to explain to them, but we work with them a lot. So they kind of just were okay with letting me do what I had to do. This is a poster for a friend's festival he was putting on. It was a little 2-day thing. And you can kind of see it in the background, but it's an old photo plate of a movie poster still, probably from an advertisement, with just superimposed type over the top of it. It was for a noise festival, and noise music is very strange. If you've never heard it, you could kind of equate it to, like, Len might appreciate this. It's like Ministry if they never learned timing or knew how to play their instruments. And then on the very opposite side, Leon Bridges, who is kind of like a modern day sort of Stax Records, soul, R&B, I guess, kind of, I would say soul mostly, but
60s soul, definitely 60s soul, not
yeah,
Motown.
Especially that this was when after he put out that first album, but still definitely. I mean, he could have easily been on Stax Records if that was still a prominent label. And so playing around with just getting a design to fit what a poster for that era would have looked like. If you're not familiar with Globe, it's Globe at Mica now, but Globe did a lot of those posters for like the Stax folks, like Otis Redding and all those kind of folks. And it's a lot of bright colors with black on top.
Hey, Cory, it looks like Dean has a question.
Yeah.
Do you have a block of Leon Bridges now?
We do.
That's so
I can't see any hands because all I can see is my presentation. So if you
I'll speak up next time.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
No, I got it, Cory. You go ahead.
So so now and that was actually a thing. I sent in the design without a photo of him, but I was also like, hey, this would look way better with a photo of him. You see, it's for the Ryman Auditorium, so I had to explain, like, you're gonna have to pay for this because it's a photo plate and it's not gonna come out of our cost, but it would look way better. And his camp or his management agreed. They were like, we would love to have the photo on there. And so then they worked out something where like his management paid for half of the plate and the Ryman paid for the other half. And so now we have the Leon Bridges photo plate. And then he actually played a show at DPAC, I think a couple weeks later. And one of the interns at the time, we asked the Ryman if they'd be okay if we used it for that poster. So it actually got used again. But now his photo plate is archived in that shelving collection that you saw earlier. This is one where, so this is a very good example of reinventing the wheel, knowing the limits of the press and all that. It's a poster for Def Leppard and Poison and Tesla. You can see it's at that same venue. I carved this one side of the Union Jack, but you can see it goes over the type as well. And so what I did for that was pressure printing, pressure printing to the extreme. And so just again, for anybody who's not familiar, in letterpress, the presses have what's called packing. And so this metal cylinder is there if it's bare, and you build up a specific amount, and it's different for each press. And it's usually like 40 hundredths of an inch of packing. But sometimes pressure printing leaves some kind of what we'll call noise, and you can kind of see it like in the L of the silver. But by cutting all the way down to the cylinder, it removes all of that pressure. So it's really just, there's nothing behind it to make it have the same pressure as there is where there's going to be packing. And that's, in this one, this is the red. You can see the block here. And so then the red of the type. And this is where it's important to know, the press, you need to know all those measurements and everything, but also understanding that, and if you've done letterpress, you've probably learned about a little bit about pressure printing maybe, but by taking all that away, you're not damaging the type, you're just taking away the pressure, where if I had added something more to where there's red, there'd be a chance where the type might be actually dented and you'd see a line where the red is. So by just taking it away, it removes it from being printed, but it's also not damaging to this type. And so I believe for this one, I printed all of it, and all the type was printed in silver. And then when I printed the red and the blue, there was some transparency in it, so that when it went over the silver, it kind of stayed metallic over the type. So that was a really fun one to work on, and one where I really pushed. And this again is on the 232. I think it's only because the other presses were in use that day. And for a while, a lot of people didn't really feel comfortable because the press was so big and there was a lot of things that were broken and would break really easily on it. So that was not my press for a while, but I kind of used it as much as I could. These are probably, again, two of my top 10 favorite jobs to work on. I don't know if any of you are familiar with John Prine, but he's an incredible
He's amazing.
songwriter and storyteller and human, and he unfortunately passed away from COVID in April, and his birthday was only a few days ago. But this is now getting into a good example of sometimes at the Ryman, they have 2-night shows. And so he had put out an album, and the last song was called When I Get to Heaven. And so all these little images are just like a line of the song relates to it somehow. And then having fun with, like, it's using the same blue, yellow, and red, but changing his last name to a different color to make it different. So if you only went to one night, you would have a awesome poster, but if you went to both, you could put them together and you'd see the whole song. And fun fact, you might recognize this building. It's just reversed, but it's the Cabot Cinema if you look really close. Only because I knew they had that great marquee that they put up. And then again, and he's also somebody who his posters, he always liked to have a lot of fun, have a lot of humor. And so all of his posters were always fun to work on. And when you're like a fan of this person or a musician, you always kind of give a little bit more to the poster and hope that they're into it. And so both of these, they were super into it. But this, he did about 3 in a row of these New Year's shows where he would play at the Grand Ole Opry House and have all these great musicians with him. And so it's just a reduction carving that relates to some lyrics in his song, but again, really fun to work on. This is a little different. You'll see that the date is the same. It's not a 2-nighter show, but they were, Echo and the Bunnymen and the Violent Femmes, they were co-headlining. So I thought it would just be fun to do. I think it was an order of like 200 posters. So I just did 100 of each. You might notice that the photo plate behind the mask and the suspenders is the same as that Noise Fest photo plate. So again, using these things that we have in the shop. But in both of those, I had to obscure the face, and that's for name and likeness issues. That's how we get around it, because if you obscure the face, there's no identity with the photo plate. But again, too, just changing the colors, changing the mask, and just having some fun with 2 bands that I really like and getting to go to the show to this one as well. This was a 2-nighter, and was my first. I was reading a lot about using offset blankets, and so from like an offset press to print off of. So the background is a block that I made that's an offset blanket mounted. And the thing with offset blankets is there's 2 positives to them: is they don't want to hold ink ever, because their purpose in the printing is to release as much ink as possible from the plate on the cylinder to the piece of paper in an offset press. And 2, they're rubber, so they're really squishy. So you can get these really beautiful, beautiful solids, and you can't really ding up the block like you can with linoleum or wood or even the Cintra board. And the other thing is you see this circle that's in the middle of both. It's it's one carving, and what I did is I made offset blanket packing. So on the cylinder was an offset blanket, and I would run it down, get this image on the blanket, and then feed one poster face down and one poster face up, and print both of these at the same time, one off of the block and one off of the offset blanket. So it was having a little fun with mirroring. That's why everything is justified left, and then right here, and then left here, and right there. And I don't think there was anything about mirroring within that related to this artist. I think the broken glass was part of it, if I remember correctly. And maybe day and night was another thing. But it was really just experimenting with this new technique of pushing the press to do something else. And it was also after, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Daffy Cooney, but he's a printer in Switzerland, and he does a lot with an offset blanket on the cylinder, and plays around with printing on the front and back of the same sheet of paper. So outside of the shop, interacting with people in the whole industry is a really great way to learn all these crazy new techniques, and just like bouncing ideas off each other, because somebody will always have a better idea or might have a little more experience with what you're trying to look for. Again, a 2-nighter show. It's the same carving, but you can see on one there's a man and a woman, and then they're together watching the fireworks. I just kind of drilled out the window area of that truck and popped in a piece of Cintra board for both of them. So on the day they were over here, and then on the night they're together watching the fireworks. Just neat little tricks that I was learning, especially early on. I had only been there for a little over a year at this point, so I was still not comfortable with pushing too much. I was still trying to take in as much as possible, and still really learning and being comfortable with sending out my own illustrations for poster designs. Just another 2-nighter, playing around with swapping colors, using some cool borders that we have in the shop. This has been my MO for the year, kind of. I mean, a lot of the year was a wash. We weren't in the shop for a lot of it, but I think this year I've done about 4 or 5 designs where it's just a bunch of borders, because it always looks really fun and cool to me. And we don't get to use the borders a lot. This was just another 2-nighter design. These are just blown up illustrations that came out of a Type Foundry sales book, I guess you would call it. So foundries that would have made type back in the day and still do now, they would have these books of like what they offer. And these would be in the book, but they would be very small. So like if you purchase these cuts, they would be about half an inch tall. So you'd put them like next to a phone number or something. But I blew them up and carved them and added the color in and all that, and just had some fun with like not putting a space in between the words, but using the color as the space, as the word break. But you can see like switching the colors again. So a lot of times when we're doing these two-nighter shows, we have a lot of fun making one poster that we can then cut in half. So you can have, if you go to both nights, and a lot of people do, they'll have this huge poster, but if you only went to one night, you'd still have a really fun poster. So this is that Tyler Childers poster that I mentioned. He did a 4-night residency. He had just put out an album called Country Squire, which was about a lot of things, but one of the title song, him and his wife, when they first got married, moved into a trailer on his like parents' land, and it was like this exact trailer, and about how they just like lived in it. So this photo plate is the size of a one sheet. So these 4 posters together, it's 40 inches wide by 26 inches tall. And so I printed that photo plate on that press where there's no inking rollers, and so I was able to do everything that I wanted, the color. And so I had a lot of fun making them like tie-dye looking, and just like some of them would be like purple at the bottom and yellow up top, and things that you wouldn't really usually be able to get a nice gradient on, but then throwing in pieces of orange and whatever, and just having a lot of fun with hand inking things. And then in the close-up, and you can see it on here too, in the close-up, but you can see it's a halftone block. So this was a huge photo plate, and then it's plaid, and so you'll see it a little bit later. But I carved a roller or a brayer that was plaid, and so I just had fun on a couple of them and made them plaid. But the idea was that even if somebody went to all 4 nights, they probably weren't going to get 4 of the same colorways like this. I just kept this one together for me. But like this night, the main color might have been yellow, and then green, and then orange, and then blue. And they would have had different looks, but you would still have the same image across all 4 posters. And that was the main thing. And then keeping the same layout and design and typography through it all, so that there was some semblance of consistency. And this was for a 6-night run for Jason Isbell in 2016, I believe. He had just put out a new album where he got back with his band. And so each night is just an instrument from somebody in the band. And then the imagery inside each night is just imagery from one song on the album. And this was like a huge... it was for the Ryman Auditorium, and they said it was one of the like fastest selling posters that they've ever seen from him for each night, to the point where like they were sold out within 10 minutes of the merch stands opening up, and people went crazy for it. But it's, you can see there's a difference between a 4-night run and a 6-night run, and sometimes they don't have to match up together to make a bigger image. They can just be 4 or 6 individual posters, but the theme is the same through it all. So the one on the left is for like a Grateful Dead cover band, I think. So just really trippy. It's on this paper that we got a sample of that's like pearl, so it's like pearlescent, and that's why the top looks like shinier and more blue than the bottom, where it looks a little more purple. And I printed this background block that we have that has a bunch of like flowers and frillies, but did pressure prints. So I printed it twice, one in the yellow and one in the orange, and printed a pressure print to make that like concentric lines, and then just printed the black on top using the skull as some kind of imagery to relate to the Grateful Dead. the House of Blob poster. It's one of our favorite, might be our favorite client in the shop. He never asks for a proof. He puts in the order, and then the first time he sees the poster is when he opens the box after we ship it to him. And it's a festival where they always show the Blob, and then they usually have a theme of what other like B horror sci-fi movies that they'll show. And it's this year it was at home, but it's usually shown in this old theater in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. And so this year the theme was House of Blob. I think they were showing House on Haunted Hill, which is why this poster looks like that kind of movie.
Sorry, Cory.
Go ahead. Oh, was that a dog?
Yeah, sorry. He almost caught himself a rabbit. Sorry.
That's all right. So it was kind of fun to work. This was the first time I've gotten to work on a poster for him, so it was fun to really just take the time to make a poster that I was really stoked on. And then I finally learned about, and you'll probably laugh because you probably have known about it for a while, but I learned about like making the wiggle tool on filters in Photoshop. So I did the illustration with straight lines and everything, and hand wiggled some of these, but it wasn't doing it for me. And then I was like messing around one day and found the wiggle filter, and I was like, yeah, that's what it needed. So again, and this was made in July. So we were just getting back into the shop after being kicked out for quarantine. And so after 6 years of using Photoshop at Hatch, and even longer since including time at Montserrat, I learned about a wiggle filter that might be my new favorite filter. A pretty fun one for the Pixies. And again, it's just like, it's a band that I like, so I'm gonna have a lot of fun making the poster. This is a photograph of Captain Thomas Ryman, who the Ryman Auditorium was named after, like the original owner. And I did some fun with printing out a photo of him and then doing some copier, like pulling it while it was making the copy, and like twisting it and then cutting those apart and putting them together. And that's why like his head's super extended here, but the nose and the mouth is pretty straightforward. And then just putting together some typography that I thought fit the Pixies aesthetic in general. So kind of a nod to like the Ryman, but it was also just like thinking about the merch. There might have been a shirt or something where the Pixies did something similar, and so I figured that they would probably go for this idea. Again, it's not a very I don't have to sit there for 20 minutes and explain to them what the poster is. I just go, here's the poster and these are what the colors are going to be, and then they either like it or they don't. This again is the background. This is the background for that you saw on the Billy Idol poster. So again, using things over and over. Just really simple 2 split fountains to make this background, and then putting this type on an angle so it just breaks that straight left to right baseline. And just a little bit funky for Brian Ferry. Just a little. Give him a little something. And then in that cabinet with all the photo plates, we have this weird photo plate of this couch, which was probably from like some furniture store was having a sale, but I really wanted to use it. And so I just kind of made my own room out of like little brass rules, and then pressure printed with Switchfoot, who was playing at the Ryman, made them the shadow of the light. So just again, using the pressure print's a technique that we use a lot, but you can actually see these lines of the shadow is because this bigger part is I did what I did on that Def Leppard poster, where I had to ended up having to cut out down to the cylinder because it was too noisy. Like it started to get over here. So sometimes while I'm on press, I have to make adjustments to get it to look how I want it to, because it has to look pretty close to what I send the client. A really big one for the shop and for the Ryman was doing the Wu-Tang Clan poster. It was the first hip hop group, I believe, to perform at the Ryman Auditorium was this show. And they were performing for the first time in like 13 years or something together. And also just like people I like. So I really wanted to do the poster. Gave it a little added spin of rounded corners, and it's printed on some paper that kind of feels like playing card texture. And for a long time, I was going to print a back to it, and then it came down to a time crunch where I didn't have enough time to do it. But I wasn't going to bother. It was one of those times where we weren't going to bother asking for the client's approval for it as long as the front was approved, because I was just going to do like one of the patterns in here on the back of the poster as a little Easter egg. The second poster for Nick Offerman, it's supposed to look like one of those little blister packs that you would get in the toy store. So it's got little, you can kind of see it, little like lines and like their little plastics, and then you could actually hang it off a rack because I punched a little hole in the top. I think in this tour he was solo, but he was talking about owning like a wood shop and also doing comedy and all that. So these were two really fun posters to work on, and both got the rounded corner treatment. So both of these posters, I was starting to learn and starting to experiment with using tape, like packing tape, as something to create texture. Because there's a point where carving is the best option. There's a point where pressure prints are the best option. There's a point where, technique A, B, or C is the best option. But I never really found a great option for making kind of natural elements in posters, like rocks and clouds and things. So in the Doobie Brothers one, the kind of cliffside that you see in the clouds, it's this one solid square is a piece of linoleum, an old linoleum block that was mounted probably in the 80s. And I just took packing tape and kind of like crinkled it and stuck it on. And so it would have heavy spots where the ink would have more impression. So the ink would look a little bit darker, and then it would have these white spots. I think I also combined the clouds with pressure printing to get those really white spots. But with like the cliffside, having to carve this would have taken forever, and then it probably would never get used again. So having to be able to do the tape and have it be a one-time thing, knowing that these are also posters that will never get reprinted. And that's a big part of it, is if they had to get reprinted, I wouldn't choose these methods that would be so hard to recreate. I would be doing other options. Like I wouldn't ever do tape for a retail product, because we know we'd have to print hundreds of thousands of them over the course of its lifetime. And then on the right, and it's a lot more subtle, but the background was, I think, just transparent ink, maybe a little bit of brown to give it just a little tint, but it was supposed to make the paper look kind of like the poster had been crumpled, somewhere between crumpled and really rough leather texture. Because the album that this guy had just put out, Zach Williams had just put out before this show, it had the similar look on the album cover, and there was really nothing to the album, and he hadn't made like merch for it, so I just kind of wanted to mirror that as much as I could. But and you can see these two were made within 15 days of each other with the shows. So I think I had tried it first on this one, really liked how it worked, and said, okay, well, I'm going to do it on the Doobie Brothers poster too. Because I got the effect that I was going for, that I knew I had a little more, I mentioned before, like I knew I could probably make this work some way when I sent the proof out without have ever tried it, where I would have never sent this proof as an idea without ever having tried it the first time.
Hey, Cory.
Yeah.
We're going to be running out of time in a little bit. I'd love to give them a chance. And I don't want to cut you short, but I'd love to give them a chance to ask some questions.
Okay.
Is that cool?
Yeah. I can go through. I think I'm almost near the end of the posters. And then so I think I can get through pretty quick.
Okay, cool.
And it's just more. So on these, it's just a little more fun about building things out of type, making it little 8-bits. Some fun, more fun with tape, and just adding a little bit to get little halos for the sky. These were two, and again, this is that photo plate that you saw in the Jim Jeffries one, so using it again for 2 Guns N' Roses shows. Same tour, they just came back a year later. This show was in the stadium the Titans played at, and the one on the right was in the arena where the Predators play, so I had a little fun with the one on the right to make it a little hockey themed. These are 2 really fun ones, and I guess a lot of this is to show, even though we're in Nashville and it's like country music central, we still get to do posters for rad metal bands and punk bands and all that. And both of them are also, you can see they're kind of tall, skinny posters, but just having fun with reduction cuts and playing with Mastodon and just put out an album where it was a lot of like Sultan-esque imagery. So kind of doing something like that. And then Slayer, it was the final tour. So kind of making it, but also like really getting a hold. You can see the difference of like the illustration of the face versus like getting all these highlights on it over there, and kind of just progressing with talent and experience and all that. Yeah, we're definitely getting close to the end, Len, so I can go pretty quick.
Thank you, Cory.
So a lot of that is leading up to like what I'm doing now, which is a lot of the times referred to in Letterpress as Daredevil typesetting. So this image was made completely with type, upside down type, but none of it was carved. These are some posters kind of highlighting some of that. You know, it's a beer can because his tour name was Beer Never Broke My Heart. But getting the little pop top, we have this one typeface that worked perfect for it, and getting the shape nice and right. This is just a show that Marty Stewart holds every year called the Late Night Jam, where he always has a bunch of people that are playing with him. So I thought making it a jukebox. I got to talk to Marty on the phone before starting, and he loved the idea before I even sent him the proof. So that was really cool. These are both pretty early on, where the last 2 were last year. Alton Brown did like an Eat Your Science tour, so it was just having fun building a robot that's eating some carrots, and he came into the shop and I got to meet him. And then in Nashville, there's a Barbershop Harmony Society school that's down the street, so that they learn how to sing barbershop quartets. So just making the barbershop pole out of type. And before I get into like the personal work that amounts to it, this is just quickly touching base. Earlier this year and last year, and this relates to like the conservator aspect, is we have a block from 1886 it's a 3-sheet of a baseball player, and I recarved it. So this was the original bottom block, and then this was the new one that I carved. This was a tool that I had to make. So again, having to engineer it to get this texture on the wood. It's literally washers that I cut and sharpen with like some old press pipe fittings that I use as handles. The workstation that I was at for a year, there was coffee and it's 15 blocks in total. So it was 5 colors for 3 sheets. So the top one that's new, you can see I'm getting ready to put the last color on. This is the final print on the right, and then a detail on the left. The shop still has 11 of the 15 original blocks, but they're all damaged and we can't print them. Like they all cut off short because at one point they were probably cut to make shelves, and we don't know where they went. But when we put these side by side with like some of the prints that from the original blocks, it was important to make sure they match. But it was also, this was a really big learning experience for me because it was a different technique of carving, and so it was kind of like a master copy in a way. And it was also really cool to carve something in the style of 1886 in 2020. This was the brayer that I was talking about for that Tyler Childers poster. So I just used a razor to cut away and then a Dremel to make the lines. One of the techniques for typesetting is this is foam board that I just cut out and then stuck the pieces in. And then it holds through a run as long as you're using like a Vandercook, like a hand crank press. And this is getting towards the end, getting into like some of the work that I'm making now is I'm working on a lot of instruments that are built out of type. So this is the first color and the second color of a bagpipe I worked on, which is what the brayer was carved for. So I printed it all in red, left the blocks in, and then inked the blocks by hand with the green of the brayer to get the plaid. And then you can see the finished line on the left and trumpet on the right. And again, it's all either little pieces of type or anything, and none of it's carved. Done some guitars, banjos, tubas, clarinet, and a dobro. And so it's really just the end goal of this. This is what I'm working on now, is to make about 75. I think I have 60 that I want to make before then I put it into like a coffee table book. But really, it's really interesting making these is because you have to abstract the instrument enough to be able to do it with a bunch of square things, because you can't really make curves. Like you can see on the tuba, it doesn't really curve, but you can't abstract it so far that you can't recognize the instrument. So it's really looking closely at the instrument to what are like the important parts that make it recognizable as what it is. And then that's it. And that's a brayer that we had that melted, and then we made Spooky.
Cory, that was brilliant. Thank you.